we'd appreciate that. And now I'd like to introduce David Moore. He's currently a senior fellow with the Carsey School at the University of New Hampshire and a former UNH professor of political science. He is co-author with Andy Smith of The First Primary, a New Hampshire's outsized role in presidential nominations, as well as Small Town, Big Oil.
50 years ago this month, on October 5th, Durham discovered for the first time via a newspaper article in Public Occurrences that there was a likelihood of an oil refinery being built on Durham Point. That was the first information they got. And that was 50 years ago. And then this book is the story of that series of events which led to almost the destruction of the seacoast area. So I'll start off by reading you, and you can read it with me, one of the introductions to a story about the seacoast area. New Hampshire is rich in natural beauty. Its 18 miles of beaches and rugged coastline are fed by a web of rivers and estuaries that fuel the economy for many New Hampshire communities. This is a story about legacy and how the actions of ordinary people can impact the lives of many for generations to come. It is also a story about recognition of the often underappreciated role that women play in society. And it is a story about today, balancing the reality of our energy needs and understanding our responsibility to our community and to our descendants. But to understand this responsibility, we must first take a step in the past. And the past we're going to look at is in 1973. If you remember about 1973, it was a time, it was the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The economic growth was sluggish and stagnant, but still there was high inflation. We think we have high inflation today. That was high inflation, double-digit inflation. Fuel shortage with long gas lines, high prices for food and fuel. This is a picture of one of the gas lines. And remember, at the time when you were here, you would be able to get your gas every other day, depending on whether your license plate ended in an odd number or an even number. And if it was a letter, it was one or the other. And then on Sunday, nobody got gas, unless there was a gas available, which typically there wasn't. In this environment, Aristotle Onassis, known primarily among Americans anyway, for his marriage to Jackie Kennedy, or Jackie O as she later became, decided that he could provide economic relief to this state, to this area of the state, and to this area of the seacoast. This is a better, more reflective picture of the kind of guy that Aristotle Onassis was. So he's the first antagonist that we are taking a look at. The second antagonist is this smiling bully from Manchester Union Leader. He was the editor, William Lowe. Everybody who's ever been here during the 60s, 70s, 80s remembers William Lowe for his front page editorials going after any of people he felt were opponents. And he was even went after the families. He went after the family of the governor, the daughter, and caused her to have a mental breakdown because of the way he pilloried her in his front page editorial. All she ever did when asked by a reporter about marijuana was say, "I don't think anything's wrong with it." That was it. And they just put her on the front page as though her father and the whole party there were drug addicts. And that she just lost her senior year school, but that was typical of what he did. That was only one kind of example. And the third major antagonist was Governor Meldrum Thompson. For those who remember, he was a Southern gentleman. He was very soft-spoken, very nice-spoken, but really had a heart of coal. He would go after his opponents. He in fact went down to Massachusetts to look at the criminal record down there to see if there was anything on any of his political opponents. He later became known for advocating that nuclear weapons be with the National Guard and that Martha's Vineyard should be annexed to New Hampshire. It wasn't clear that people in New Hampshire wanted that, but that was part of what he wanted. And what he also really wanted, he was elected in '72, primarily with the support of the Union leader. What he really wanted was an oil refinery in the state. The 6 New England states were cooperating. Well, the 6 New England states, minus New Hampshire, were trying to figure out the best place. He wanted it for himself, for this state. So that was well known right from the beginning. So Aristotle Onassis came to the front on that. He proposed to build an oil refinery on Durham Point. 400,000 barrels of oil every day. It's just staggers the imagination. Worth $3.2 million, the investment into building it. 15,000 new jobs were promised. More gas and home heating oil in this area was promised, and large tax break for Durham. As it turns out, those 3 promises were all fake. There were no new jobs. There were a few new jobs, but most of the new jobs would have been for people who had experience in that area, which did not include people from New Hampshire. And more gas and home heating oil, that was absolutely false. And the reason it was false is that all the heating oil and energy was dispersed by the federal government on a regional basis. So New Jersey, even though it had all those oil refineries, got no more oil, still had gas lines as well as everybody else. So that was a fake promise. And then a large tax break for Durham. Eventually that was shown to be false as well, because the only thing, according to state law, that could be taxed was a maintenance shed that would be in Durham. The energy could not be taxed. So although these promises were made over and over again, it was what today we know as fake news. So this was the proposed refinery. Over here, the Isles of Shoals, which I'm sure we all know about. This is Lunging Island. From Lunging Island, there was going to be a pier and a monobuoy, and it was going to go underwater pipe over to Concord Point in Rye, across the land through what was then Pease Air Force Base, across Great Bay, and there into New Hampshire. Into Durham. As you can see by the black outline, that's the outline of the Durham border. And the red are the pieces of property that had been purchased, optioned by the oil refinery. You can see it was going to dominate the town. So the offshore marine terminal, the two-berth terminal design, positioned off Lunging Island, capable of having a very large something containers, CC for something container. Anyway, with these humongous oil ships, capable of having with an 80-foot draft. Lunging Island was for staging. Star Island was for navigational equipment. And that comes later when we talk about the kind of manipulation of the news that was done. So this is Lunging Island with Honeymoon Cottage. This gives you an idea of kind of how large it was and how beautiful it was. This is a profile of Lunging Island. So this, at the top, that little rabbit ears up there, is Honeymoon Cottage. This is a superimposition of the very large containers that would be containing all that oil. We're talking about humongous ships. So this is a picture looking out eastward from behind UNH, looking out eastward down Oyster River and looking at that whole area of the Oyster River all on the right-hand side. That's primarily where the oil refinery would have been. This is an example that what Olympic refineries did was present a model of what it would look like. And it was first presented to the legislators in Concord. And that's where this model, you can see all sorts of important people looking at this model to see what it would be like. This is what the model looked like once you got inside of it. The problem was that they used two different scales. So the scales here, which were all the storage tanks, were more or less to scale. That little refinery, that teeny little refinery in there, was half the scale. So it gave you the impression, oh, this isn't so bad. Not a, just a little refinery. One way to look at it is to look at what a typical refinery looked at ground level. And now here I want to I've got my glasses. Today we have in the audience Katie Wheeler as well as Jane Lenhart, both of whom, I mean, I know other people were there at the time, but Jane worked on public occurrences at some point, and Katie played a not insignificant role. And I'm going to read to you a letter that she wrote to Constantine Gratsos, who was Onassis's right-hand man. And she was trying to get him to come down and visit so he would get some appreciation. So I'm going to take the time to read a letter. It's pretty short. November 29th, 1973. Dear Mr. Gratsos, please come to Durham, walk around the town, visit a town meeting, see the beauties of Durham Point, and talk to the people before you continue with your plans to build a refinery which would irrevocably destroy one of the last lovely places to live. Would you put a refinery next to your house? We are a small, cohesive town which has consistently voted against even light industry, feeling that the promised tax advantages were overshadowed by the possible environmental destruction. We in Durham will fight to the end to prevent the destruction of Durham Point and our tiny bay, but we wish that you would come to visit us so that you will understand and perhaps sympathize with our opposition. Sincerely, Catherine W. Wheeler. December 4th, 1973. Dear Mrs. Wheeler, I wish to acknowledge receipt of your letter of November 29th, for which I thank you. I had the opportunity, both in the past and this summer, to visit New Hampshire, and particularly the Durham Peninsula, and I cannot agree more with you as to the loveliness of the place. Unfortunately, the evolution of the world since the Industrial Revolution and the universal population explosion will inevitably result in the elimination of all that you and I and many other people cherish. In other words, today and in the future, we will have to choose between existence and beauty. Aesthetically, a modern refinery, when illuminated, looks more like a Christmas tree than anything else, and is not uglier than the modern sculptural masterpieces adorning the streets of the major capitals of the world. Very truly yours, Constantine Gratsos. Well, I mentioned that, and I make particularly since Katie's here. So this is what a lit up refinery looks like as a Christmas tree. As opposed to what most people in New Hampshire think of.
That's great.
Okay. So, in the breach, there were 3 young women who became the leaders of the opposition. And in this presentation today, I'm going to talk to you mostly about the events. But there's a lot of personal story that's also involved. For example, I'll just briefly mention, Nancy was a young mother, had considered herself nothing but a housewife, but she was also a farmer. She was harvesting their apple trees, was planting more of them, and she suddenly got thrust into a leadership position for the town to try to organize the town against the refinery. Suddenly, she was thrust in this position and had no previous experience, but certainly did quite well, and you can see the troubles that she faced in doing so. Also, there's Dudley Dudley, who most people recognize as the iconic representative of the oil refinery. In fact, her picture's on the front of the book because she was a first-time elected representative to the New Hampshire House. And suddenly, she became the person in the state legislature that was supposed to be the face of New Hampshire, the face of Durham, and the face of actually the environmentalists and people opposed to the refinery. And it was up to her to make the arguments. And this person, 37-year-old mother, 2 daughters, who had never had any experience before, was suddenly thrust into that leadership position. And she got pilloried by the union leader. This is Fuddy Duddy, Dum Dum Dudley, you go on. That was Deadly Dudley, lots of different names. And then finally, there's Phyllis Bennett. Phyllis Bennett and her husband, Steve Bennett, established public occurrences fortuitously in the summer before all these events took place. And they established it to cover the seacoast area. It's an interesting coincidence that it happened and so important for the way in which the events played out. Because Foster's Daily Democrat wasn't covering it, and certainly the union leader wasn't going to cover it, and even Concord Monitor, when they first heard about it, seemed to think this was quite an interesting and good idea for the state. But public occurrences turned out to be crucial. And part of her story, of course, is that while she and Steve founded the paper, ultimately he left her for a young woman that they had hired to run their graphics machine, and he abandoned it, saying that the paper was losing money, he was giving up on it, and she persisted, and eventually won a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize. But, okay, now back to the story. Those are personal stories that are included in the book that I don't have really time to cover too much. Okay, so on October 5th, 1973, an oil refinery on Durham Point. And if you turn to page 3, you'll find something that said, real estate blitz on Durham Point. That was it. And he talked about all the people who had been approached. Nancy Sandberg, by the way, was a person, when she was approached, thinking this person, Peter Boros, who was insistent on buying part of the property and coming up with all sorts of different reasons why he wanted to, she went and talked with a lot of her neighbors. And they had also been approached by different people wanting a nature preserve, isolation, had nothing to do with development. And they were all Creek, which indicated they were all working together in some way. This is not a slight against any nationality. This is a merely factual reporting that they were Greek and turned out to be working for Onassis, who's also Greek. So, the oil refinery then became a humongous issue. Once the public occurrences notified people that it was there. It took us several weeks before the governor finally acknowledged that this was indeed his intent to help Onassis establish an oil refinery in the town along Durham Point. Public occurrences turned out to be extremely important because there were all sorts of reports that were done by university professors, engineers, economists, who were able to talk about what the implications were for an oil refinery. And so all those reports were then published in public occurrences so that the townspeople had a constant update of what information was available about the oil refinery. And this oil refinery here, that's Evelyn Brown, who was particularly upset because she had 2 pieces of property. And she had agreed that she would sell one piece, a smaller piece, because she was trying to sell it, but not for development, just in case somebody wanted to buy the house. But George Papademos apparently came to her house while she wasn't there and looked inside her house and told her. And when she said, "I'll never sell," he said, "Little lady, I'll bet I'll buy those white planks right out from under you," which was creepy, to put it at the least. And she was really upset because she agreed to an option on the second property under the mistaken belief it would not be for development. Bob Nielsen was a cartoonist, and so he drove, you can see Onassis, and you can see, Governor Melvin Thompson, and you can see Peter Boris. I'm not sure the other eyes and classes behind him were there. That's clearly Evelyn Brown that's there. That's Bob Nielsen down there with Seacoast Communities all over, and he drew himself in there. And that's clearly Dudley standing there. Not quite sure everybody else, but a little lady, we only wish to go to a nature park, a retirement home, and a game preserve. Okay. So Nancy helped organize, and among the various things that the town, under the group of what they called Save Our Shores, SOS, which was a nice acronym. And so SOS was able to get the townspeople together in December for a meeting at which all these professors and experts came forth and talked about what the implications were for an oil refinery. And that's a picture of Nancy there talking. Obviously, her picture is from the stage, so we don't see who's there, but there are many people that are there. In addition to the presentations, there was an outreach by Sharon Baker, happened to be on the outreach committee. Karen Maurer happened to be the person who was in charge of coordinating work with university professors and experts. And Celeste Mambro was the person who worked closely with Sharon Baker on the outreach. But in any case, as a part of the outreach, they had petitions. They got petitions to be signed, everybody opposing the petitions. And at one point, he took the petitions all the way down from one end of town all the way up to the post office on the other end of town. As you can see, this is, typically winter in New Hampshire and Durham. So that they have these petitions all pasted together. So the bright idea came, well, let's take the petitions up and show them to the governor, Governor Melvin Thompson. That sounds like good. So Dudley got the chance to do that. And so she took all the petitions up. Yeah. She had somebody knows what's going on. She had an appointment to see with the governor, and he canceled it. She'd gone all the way up there back. Second time she had another appointment. This time he canceled it because he wanted to go down and talk about increasing the number of snowmobiles. I said, really? this is a time when we have no gas and you're worried about increasing snowmobile? Yeah, that's where he was. So she went there the third time, still thinking that it would not work. But so she got into the executive council office, which was right off in the governor's office. She had all these petitions, and there were reporters around, and they were talking to her. She thought she was never going to be called in anyway. So she kind of showed him and said, maybe you want to take a picture of me with my husband's ancestor, who was Tom Dudley, who was a previous president of, back in the 1700s, president of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Dudley's picture is up there. So she was having the picture taken when the administrative assistant for the governor came out and said, the governor wants to see you. So she tries to get all these petitions together. She walks in and they're kind of a mess. They choose her out for why are all those petitions that are this? Why are you here? And she said, well, somebody was taking a picture. He said, oh, you just wanted publicity for yourself. He said, no, I wanted to let you know about what some of your constituents think about. He said, how do I know they're even registered voters? And she said, Governor, whether they're registered or not, they still are your constituents. That didn't go over well. Now, I mean, he's used to be calling Your Excellency. Your Excellency or Governor is either appropriate. Either term is appropriate. But she used Governor. And then, and he said, I don't understand why people in Durham won't like this thing. Like this oil refinery. You're short of oil, and you get more gas and oil and so on. And she said, well, Governor, the real problem here is not with refining the oil. It's within getting the oil. And an oil refinery is not going to solve that problem. Get out of here. Get out of here. Get off your high horse and get out of here. And so here's a picture of Dudley right after. She's got those petitions in her hand. And she said to the reporters that out there that she was badly treated. And the governor's office released a statement a little bit later about how she had been rude or something of that. In any case, Dudley sometimes thinks she looks kind of crazy there, but I think she looks triumphant. So the other person that was involved at the state level in helping Dudley behind the scenes was Chris Spiro. He called himself the other Greek. He was the Greek opposed to the oil refinery. He was the assistant minority leader. Democrats were all in the minority at the time. And he was the one who was busy trying to go around and talk to various representatives whom he knew. He had been in the legislature longer than she had. So he was working behind the scenes, and he was a dynamo. If you ever get a chance to talk to him, although I don't think he's anywhere around these days. Okay. Well, in December, Onassis decided to visit Durham. And he was going to fly over Durham Point. And he did. This is a picture after he flew over Durham Point. And he actually was quite sick at the time. Nobody knew it at the time, but he was quite sick. And in fact, he died a year and 1 week later. But at the time, he was having a lot of marital problems, so to speak, between him and Jackie. And after he left here, he flew back to Greece, and he was busy trying to rewrite his will so that she wouldn't get any of his money. In any case, at this point, he was suffering from a very serious disease, and so he didn't look very dynamic. But of course, people in New Hampshire didn't know that. And knowing that he was going to be flying in a helicopter over Durham Point, landing at Adams Point, where the governor was waiting with his limo and would take him up Durham Point Road and show him where it was. Well, in the meantime, as he was flying over, there are all these busybodies out there.
Oh, no.
I don't know if you can tell, but it does say, not here.
What were they using?
Not here. And then there were other places that had Ari go home. When he got down to Adams Point, he did not get out of the helicopter.
Oh.
He flew back to Bedford for the press release. He did not feel welcome. So there were some concerns. There were a feeling Thompson was trying to skirt the big argument that Dudley was making in favor of rejecting the oil refinery was not what you might think, that it would be an environmental disaster. Because Chris Spiro had already talked with her about the importance of home rule. Home rule, you can say, if the town doesn't want it, particularly with zoning things, the town shouldn't have to take it. And that was such a long part of New Hampshire tradition. To say it's an environmental disaster would be allowed all those people, no, it's not, we don't, it's the cleanest oil refinery, it looks like a Christmas tree when lit up, you know, all those kinds of arguments. So she had to make the argument that it was against home rule. And the governor ostensibly went along with it, but at the same time was working with legislators as they were preparing a bill to establish that any oil refinery would go under a site committee. The site committee existed for other kinds of environment, but no oil refinery. So we'll put the oil refinery with the site committee. And then as an amendment to that were the people who wanted the oil refinery located here. And so the amendment was, the site committee shall have final authority over where to place the oil refinery. In the meantime, Dudley had a bill, a home rule bill, that said that no town or location, city, would be forced to have it without first a vote from the people. So there were two competing bills. The problem was that the Onassis people, the Olympic people, were getting pretty aggressive and pretty much had option over almost 1,000 acres out of Durham Point. And they also wanted to get Lunging Island. I talked to you importance of Lunging Island. Peter Burroughs first made the offer because it was owned by a family, by the Randall family, and they had to get it. And so they were offering money for it. And the Randall said no, because they had been several generations. So George Stamolitos, who was a friend of Burroughs, kept saying that it had nothing to do with an oil refinery. They just wanted it for themselves, and they were paying a high price for it, and they wouldn't sell. Finally, they recognized that if they didn't sell, that it might be taken by eminent domain. And also a part of that was that the Olympic refinery people claimed that they already had options on Star Island, which they did not. And so the Randalls felt, if Star Island's gone and we don't sell now, we're not going to get anything. So they finally agreed. And Mrs. Randall said, like a death of the family. Now we come to finally, notice that this is March 1st when they finally reported it, because it only happened a few days earlier. Finally, don't forget, town vote is in March 4th, and the state vote is on March 6th. So we're talking the week before. The vote is supposed to be held. Olympic finally gives its presentation about the details. Well, people weren't too happy with it. And there was one person who was particularly insistent on one particular provision of it, which said that they required 6,000 gallons of fresh water per minute. It's a lot of water. So Cliff Horrigan, she was a graduate student in hydrology at the time. Her husband was Jim Morgan, who had already had some economic arguments against the employment thing. So Cliff Oregon, dressed in typical boots, stocky person, definitely formable, with a plaid shirt, gets up in front of Mr. Green there, who's off on the left, with all of his experts and said, Mr. Green, you say that you need 6,000 gallons of fresh water per minute. Where are you going to get it? So he looks at it. He turns around. He goes back to his feet. He comes back and he says, I think we only need 3,000 gallons. And she said, Mr. Green, where are you going to get 3,000 gallons of water, fresh water per minute? And again, and I'm not kidding you, this is absolute fact. He turns around to his expert. He comes back and he says, we're only going to need 1,500 gallons of water. At that point, any credibility that they might have had totally shot. Up here is Celeste DeMambro. She's the one off on the left who was one of the people that worked on it. And she says, does Olympic's promise to still stand mainly to uphold the wishes of the people of Durham? And if not, how are we expected to believe you? They had another presentation. She said, leave your number at the front desk and don't call us. We'll call you. Another thing that came up was Barbara Rutledge, a member of the board of Star Island, said Olympic doesn't have an option to buy on Star Island. Star won't sell you 1 inch of land at any price. Okay, now we come to the conclusions here. This is on Monday. Remember, this was just on Sunday, Monday, the previous week. The following week, on Sunday, with this insert, it's actually a 8-page insert into all of the newspapers in New Hampshire that had Sunday editions. And it was, help bring a refinery to New Hampshire. A poll showed that 65% of New Hampshire people supported an oil refinery. Why New Hampshire needs a refinery. Then on the inside list was a list of every single House member who was going to vote, all 400 of them, with their telephone numbers and address. And they were encouraged to call their reps and tell them to vote for the Iowa oil refinery. Well, it backfired. The reason it backfired is that even though the poll said that 65% supported it, when they were asked, the governor, they used that to try to encourage all the towns in the town meeting to go ahead and have an informal vote. And most of the informal votes said, yeah, we support it as long as the town supports it. So the home rule argument prevailed. And so all of these representatives, instead of getting calls in favor, were getting calls opposed to the oil refinery. Okay, so then there was a big vote in the town, covered by all the national news, all the major news were there. They were covering this. And the person over here is Tommy Thompson. Tommy Thompson was a person who wanted the oil refinery. He had had a farm, and he was basically priced out of it, and he wanted the oil refinery because he thought that it would increase the value of his land. So he was the only representative of a small group of people who wanted the oil refinery. And he actually, when Onassis came, he was the only person from Durham who got to meet with Onassis and give him his petitions, like 20 or 30 of them, that he gave to Onassis against the oil refinery. In any case, so the Durham votes 1,200 times no. Durham says no 9-1. 1,200 times. This is a picture that was taken of all the people holding up their cards. If you were a voter, you got to go in. If you weren't a voter, you got shoved off into an overflow room, but you could still watch. So this is what they voted. Well, the real problem after that was what's going to happen in the House. And so there were all these presentations. Dudley made her presentation. Everybody did. And then right before the vote, a representative supposedly coming from Mr. Simon, who was then the energy czar in Washington, D.C., he had a note that he wanted to let everybody know that if New Hampshire accepted an oil refinery, they would get a special amount of oil and fuel. Turned out later to be denied by Simon's office. But somebody from the governor's office came out and made that statement right before they voted. So they had a voice vote. They start off with a voice vote. Now this is the first one on the amendment to the site. If you vote yes, you're voting yes that the site committee has the final say. If you vote no, it doesn't have the final say. So everybody in favor say aye, and there was this thunderous roar, aye. And Chris Spiro and Dudley and everybody from Durham just, their hearts sank. And they said, everybody opposed, say aye. A thunderous roar for people against it. Didn't know that there were so many old people with strong voices. Anyway, so then they had to, so that was the voice vote. So then they had to have a standing vote, and this standing vote gives you the actual number. So everybody who had stood up in favor, and everybody later who stood up opposed. According to that, 121, 36.7% voted yes, 209 no, and everybody just went wild. You know, it had been defeated. But then, one of the Republicans, who was for the refinery and wanted to embarrass those who were against it, called for a roll call vote. And immediately, several representatives began heading for the door. So they had the sergeant of arms close the door to prevent them. And everybody had to vote again. And this time, the roll call vote, 109. So the margin went from, well, you can figure it out, 88 to 114, I think, something like that. So 124. So it was defeated. And afterwards, as Dudley would tell the story, she and everybody from New Hampshire were sitting at the restaurant out in Concord. And over there, they saw Mr. Green, Bob Green, and all of his group. And they were, busy, celebrating. And then they get up and they walk over to the table. All they're going to say is, this was home rule, but Newmarket voted for it. So we're going to try for Newmarket. They knew that that's what was going to be said. Instead, they walked over, and Bob Green said, we think the right side won. That's what they said. And so anyway, eventually what happened is that right after the vote, which defeated the Reed Amendment, they voted in favor. Of course, there was just a pro forma to vote for the site committee. And then after that, Dudley's vote, the bill came up, and it was pro forma as well. The problem is, it had been watered down because the Attorney General had said, most towns are already protected. But that wasn't really true. So what happened is about 2 weeks later, there were hearings in Portsmouth. David Nixon was the president of the Senate. And they amended the bill that had been sent over to them from the House so that it contained all the words that Dudley had originally put in. And so it was reinstated, and of course it went back to the House, and then the governor, by then, he had lost, you know, he couldn't not sign it, not to sign something on home rule, you know, behind the scenes, he was trying to defeat it, but not, you know, up publicly. So that's what happened. And then, here, 40 years later, are the three women. There's Nancy Sandberg, Phyllis Bennett, and Dudley Dudley sitting on the block. And that, by the way, is sitting on Emily. So, and Durham says no to oil refinery. But before it was put out there, they got this picture. Dudley and Nancy are still with us. Phyllis, unfortunately, has passed away in my time. But that is the story of how these three women saved the New Hampshire Sea Coast. Questions? Anyway, you have questions or comments or so on? Yeah.
You mentioned Celeste DeMambro,
Yes.
and this library is in the DeMambro house, same family?
Yes, it is. Yeah, Art DeMambro and Celeste DeMambro were a couple, and this was their house. And when Art DeMambro decided to retire and move, he made a provision with the Board of Trustees, Durham Library Board of Trustees, and all of you could tell the tremendous architecture that was done to modify it. But yeah, this is the same place, kind of nice to know about it. So, I'm not really trying to hawk my book, but if you want to read a copy of it, you can get it in the library. And if you want a copy of it yourself, I'd be glad to do it. $15 for the book. And if there's an audio book, which if you so inclined, costs $20. This is an expense, so I'm not going to get rich off this stuff. But anyway, it's something to do. Any other comments? Yes, go ahead.
Have you reported an oral history anywhere? Or, for example, the Library of Congress collects oral histories.
If so, I am not aware of it. What I relied on for a lot besides individual interviews was also the public occurrences, which at that time, the whole set of public occurrences was in the UNH library. And I'm not sure, but I think there may be a copy eventually here. I'd hoped at some point to be digitized, but I don't know how many people are going to be going back and looking at it at this point. But anyway, it went for 2 years. It went from 73 to 75. And in 70, what happened is that Phyllis was able to get some funding, mostly from the Boston Globe. Her first initial amount was something like $250,000, but they kept the funding going until basically the summer of 75. And at that point, you know, things were really bad for local newspapers. It was hard for the Boston Globe, but the Boston Globe really liked the newspaper and was the first one to talk about this tremendous local newspaper. So eventually, you know, it only lasted for 2 years, but fortunately, at a time when it was played a historic, super important role. Okay. All right, good.
So, you mentioned that there were a bunch of people from UNH who, you know, testified to people about what this meant. What were the basic arguments used there to persuade Durham that they didn't want to become Louisiana?
Well, I think it was Jim Horgan who talked about employment, talked about the employment problem, and talked about the nature of the employment that this would bring. The tax thing, I think, that was done by Sam Reed. Sam Reed had a big article in the paper in which he looked at all the laws, New Hampshire laws, and talked about why that could be. And then it became clear that Gail Ulrich was another engineer talking about what was the nature of an oil refiner. How big was it? What did it require? What does it mean for 400,000 barrels of oil a day? They had one in California that had recently been built. It was considered a large one with 70,000 barrels of oil a day. This would have been the largest one in the world, right here at Durham Point. Not only that, they were talking about satellite industries. They were talking about, and it's not just the oil, but all the spin-offs from what could be done with oil. And this whole seacoast area would be quite different from what it is today. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you a real quick story. This is about rye. So in rye, you know, they had a meeting of all the people in rye to figure out what rye was going to support. And they initially they thought it might be okay. It was just a fight. But in the meantime, what had happened, there was a pilot who lived in rye and flew out of New York. Said he talked to Peter Horn, who was head of the environmental group, and said, "I'm going down to New York, where Olympic Refinery is. Should I go in and talk to him?" He said, "Yeah, find out whatever you can." So he goes in, and he goes in, and they said, "Well, we're all kind of busy right now, but we could have you watch some videos of how we put our underground pipe there." He said, "Fine," it was great. And so he watched the video. And then when it came out, he said to him, "When you come to Rye into New Hampshire, be sure to bring that video." And so they did. In the meeting, the representatives, the Olympic Refinery, Bob Green and his cohort, were busy. They were a little bit late. In the meantime, a couple of New Hampshire engineers had talked about the spillage that would occur all up and down, from Maine down to Cape Ann, all the way, all that spillage. And this was not, it wasn't a question of would there be oil leaks, it was a question of how much there would be. And given 400,000 barrels of oil a day, you know, there would be this amount. And then you only needed this amount per cubic foot of water in order to kill lobster larvae. So they had this big presentation. So then Green comes in and they talk about it, and they said, well, they asked him about, well, do you have any studies? He said, no, we don't have any studies. They had studies that haven't been done yet. So Mr. Professor Hawcroft had this great big thing, and he walks up and he throws this great big thing of study at the guy's feet. Well, here it is. And in any case, after that, they showed the video. And with the video, it's got this music, this big thing. They're showing the shore where they're going to put we're going to put the oil pipe, and then all of a sudden, boom! A humongous explosion as they blow up the beach so that they can make room for this oil pipe. And the people in the meeting were stunned. People were violent, you know. Anyway, after that, there wasn't a single person who was saying, this is going to be good for Rye. It's fishing industry, it's tourist industry, even its living, you know, this was not it. So there was a lot that went on to discredit discredit the oil refinery effort and saying what an environmental disaster would be. Although, keep in mind, it was the home rule that prevented it from going into Durham. And maybe the other places, Newmarket, Rochester, which seemed to be in favor of it, might have been willing to have it. But by then, Onassis was on his way out. He was humiliated, and he was sick, and he was having marital problems, and life was not good for him. His son had died only a year earlier, in which he thought was a CIA plot. It turns out it wasn't. It had to do with a malfunction of the plane, so that when you turned it to the right, when you turned the levers, it would indicate you're going to the right. it actually went left. And so the plane crashed, and he thought for sure that the CIA was behind it, particularly, he had been at odds with Bobby Kennedy for years before that. But a lot of that, you get that in the book if you want to, but that's what the status of Onassis was at the time and why he didn't persist beyond that. So, okay, so I think it's
Okay.